Hey, it's Tandy with the Common Ground Alaska podcast, and I am really excited to go into today's talk because I get to dispel some myths and speak some truth. And although this has nothing to do with politics, I promise it actually has to do with your orchard. It's a little cathartic after this last week with everything that's going on. I I wanted to talk about common myths when buying and planting and adding to plants to your orchard. So this is specific to Alaska. So this is just common mistakes when buying orchard plants and common mistakes in their aftercare. We get these comments all the time. We get these questions all the time, and I thought, man, might as well just address it all in one podcast, and that way, when if you have any questions at all, hopefully this will answer them. However, if you ever have questions, I do invite you to email me at tandy@commongroundalaska.com, or you can reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram with your questions. We're always here to help. And we would so much rather see you be successful in your orchard than have you suffer because you didn't really want to bug us or whatever. We've made all the mistakes. We're happy to maybe help you so you don't have to, especially with orchard stuff, because orchard plants, because they take years to produce. So it's a major bummer to plant an apple tree, say that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, and then find out 5 or 6 years into it that it wasn't the best option. Please reach out to us with any questions that you ever have. We love to help, and we just want to see you be successful. I do ask that whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever, it really helps us out if you just click follow. It's simple, doesn't cost you a thing, takes less than a second, and it definitely helps us out. So be sure you follow us, and we'll try to keep putting out excellent content for you so we're worthy of the follow. One thing I want to mention before we get started, I'll mention this at the end too, but our plant presale is currently happening. Today is it's Veterans Day. Today is November 11th, 2024, and the presale is going on until December 31st of 2024. And basically what that means is you save a few bucks per plant. It helps us out when we do presales. We know, get a good idea of how many plants we're going to need that year. And we also, it just kind of saves us some money when we can bulk buy, and then we pass the savings on to you. So if you want to participate, go to commongroundalaska.com, go to shop, and then the plants, and you'll find it. They're pretty easy to find. Again, the sale goes until the 31st of December. You can buy plants after that, but you have to pay full retail. Right now they're a few bucks off. I am ready to start talking about common mistakes that people make when buying their orchard plants and common mistakes in their aftercare. If you have heard me talk about much of anything at all having to do with gardening or planting, or anything, actually, I should say, having to do with buying plants, I would say you've probably already heard this before, but if you continue hearing me in the future, you're going to hear it again. The first thing you always have to do when you're bringing plants in from outside, from anywhere, from any store, any place, whether you're shipping them up, whether you just went to a nursery, whether you went to, a big box, especially if you went to a big box store. I mean, seriously, but you've got to quarantine your plants. Don't put them in with the general population, because if those plants have bugs of any sort or any type of disease, it's going to show up pretty quickly in your on the new plants that you got. And if they're quarantined, you can, depending on how bad it is, you can either toss them, which I've been known to do. If it just seems too bad, I'll just light the whole thing on fire and be done. Or you can treat them, which is usually the better option. And before you spread it to the general population of your orchard, it's just so important. And it doesn't matter if it's house plants, it doesn't matter if it's plants going in your garden, it just doesn't matter. Please just quarantine them. They need about a week. If you see some bugs or something, I don't know if actually have another podcast about that, but we should. Um, but there's ways to get around it. Email me if you have questions. But seriously, do not introduce bugs into the general population because you get behind them and then they're really hard to manage. Just a hint as to why. Did you know that an aphid is born pregnant? Imagine that. That's why they're so danged hard to manage. So always quarantine. All right. My first advice is to know your zone. So we did not know our zone. We assumed we were zone 3 like all of our neighbors, but it turns out because our property is a little hilly and we've got some pretty significant low spots, we've got several spots that are zone 2. It was a hard lesson to learn because our zone 3 and zone 4 plants that we got did not do well, obviously. So you need to know your zone. If you don't know your zone, a quick Google search will tell you roughly what your area is. They've got maps, which is super helpful, but they also have charts that'll show you, your latest. I think it goes by like your first frost, your last frost, and your average cold temps and your average high temps. So, and like it goes, I don't know how in depth it goes. But it is really important to know your zone. Most of us here in South Central are zones 3, 4, or 5. Some are zone 2. So, like nothing zone 9 is going to grow up here. Nothing, not a thing. I mean, it might grow if it's a annual, it may do okay for 1 year, but you're not going to get a perennial to do well. So knowing that is important, but there's a big difference between zone 3 and zone 5. So it's really important that you know your own specific property and know that your property probably has microclimates. I can push a zone 3 right next to the house. We're south facing. And so right there in that bed next to the house, I can easily get a zone 3 and like a zone 3B. Because it's right next to the house. It gets the heat of the house. It gets the reflection of the sun off the house heating that bed. And so, but I certainly couldn't do that in the low-lying spots of the property. So that's important to know your zone. Another thing is to know your variety. Now, I'm going to pick on a very specific apple, because because it's such the perfect example. So know the variety of what you're purchasing. Here, I'm going to give you an example here. So Honeycrisp apples, okay? They can work in our zone. They actually can go down to zone 3 and still survive. They bloom at the right time. You can put them on a good hardy rootstock. You can do all the things right. And they say that they ripen towards the end of September. Here's what we run into. And here's what frustrates me for anyone who sells the Honeycrisp apple to Valley people, especially. Honeycrisp, any apple that says it's going to ripen towards the end of September, that is by lower 48 standards. They're going by a lower 48 bloom time. They're going by a lower 48 ripening season and a lower 48, the final ripening time. So in Alaska, anything at all, you need to add 3 to 4 weeks from what the tag says. So now let's think about this for a second. If the Honeycrisp apple ripens at the end of September, push that back 3 or 4 weeks. Where does that put you? That puts us to the end of October, at least the middle of October, if not the end. Are we able to pick apples? Are we above freezing still at the end of October? Not usually. And the problem is that the days are so much cooler that there's no more ripening happening. So the moral of that story is you just bought a Honeycrisp. It's going to be hardy. It's going to grow. It's going to pollinate, and it's going to produce an apple. But it probably won't ripen an apple. So you're going to have a bunch of unripe apples. There's ways you can go around that. You can bring them inside. You can let them stay on the tree for a while longer, even if they're freezing. You can bring them inside, but it's not the same. And here's what frustrates me. There are some really good Alaska variety of apples that will do well, that are every bit as good as a Honeycrisp, but the plant will thrive. You don't have to go through all that, and you don't have to worry about, oh, we have to have a good summer or I'm not going to have any ripe apples. In my opinion, it's irresponsible to sell apples that aren't going to ripen to the majority in your specific area. And I get it. It's mostly big box stores, and there's somebody Nebraska or something, Minnesota deciding what plants come up, and they don't know, and I get that. But that's why I'm informing you. So please don't buy Honeycrisp apples. Buy a Prairie Sensation or something of that like that's a very comparable apple that's actually going to thrive up here, that's going to ripen every year. So um, that's an important thing about knowing the variety. If you hear nothing else, remember this. Whatever the tag says for ripening time, add 3 to 4 weeks to that, and that's going to be your Alaska ripening time. So even with strawberries, we used to do you pick strawberries. Jean worked on a huge farm in Oregon, and um strawberry season is in June. And so I would always say on the 4th, if we were doing something for the 4th of July, I'd say, oh, can you just bring me home like, a couple cups of strawberries from out in the field so I can make this, red, white, and blue dessert. And he'd always be like, man, I don't think I can find that many because they're just done. The season is over. Well, and so, but here we're lucky to getting started with strawberries in July. So it's just an example of how everything is pushed back a little. Our springs are later, they're usually cooler, and it just takes a little bit longer for things to ripen. So be sure you add that ripening time when you're looking on the tag. Another thing to know is planting on a north slope can delay into the frost for things like late ripening apples. If you have slopes on your property, if you're wanting to plant something on your slopes, if it's a south facing slope, it's the perfect spot for apples, cherries, things like that. But a north facing slope, and that's going to be your slope that thaws the latest. It's still got snow when everything else is thawed out. You've got that spot that's still got snow on it. You can still use those slopes. You can put things like honeyberries and even Saskatoons in there because they just don't mind the cold and they don't mind the later spring, and there's still plenty of time to get them ripened. So, but it will delay your ripening time. So you might have some honeyberries on a south-facing slope and some honeyberries on a north-facing slope. And the south-facing slope, those bushes might be completely done before the north-facing ones are even ripened yet, because of the difference just in that slope and the difference in the heat. So something to consider. Another thing that I recommend is to know the rootstock. Now, not all of your plants are going to be grafted onto a rootstock, and this is a little bit tricky, so I'm going to try to simplify it. So no, this isn't like an in-depth science class. This is just simplified because I don't want you to make these mistakes, okay? So all apples are grafted. Every single apple that you buy is going to be on a separate rootstock from what the actual apple tree is that's producing. So you should be able to see what that rootstock is if you look on the tag. If the tag doesn't tell you it'll tell you the variety of the apple, but if it doesn't tell you the rootstock, I wouldn't buy it because it's probably just some general lower 48 rootstock that is an Alaska Hardy. So I would start with, there's 3. There's one called Antonovka. There's one called Bud 118. That's all we use on our farm. And there's one called Baccata. Those 3 are ones to know. Put them in your notes in your phone or whatever. Again, it's Antonovka, Bud 118, and Baccata. Those are 3 to have that should do well here. There's a couple of others, but those are the 3 main ones. You could also do, I guess, a Dalgo crabapple rootstock will work as well. So, but if it doesn't say what the rootstock is, or if it's something that's not on this list, I would research before I buy the apple. Here's the thing. I think this is what makes me, I'm kind of going back to the Honeycrisp thing, because it gets under my skin. It makes me mad that people want to profit off of folks who just want to grow their own food, but you're not getting educated, so you're going to get something that's not going to work. So always ask questions, and if someone can't answer, don't buy, and find someone who can. So you need to ask questions like, will this do well in my area? And here's the thing, even if you're buying from, say, a nursery in Anchorage, make sure you tell them, especially if you live in Talkeetna, like something might do really well in Anchorage, but it is not going to do as well in Talkeetna. So make sure you're letting them know where you are. But Yeah, knowing your rootstock is very important. Bushes don't typically have a different rootstock. Most bushes just come on their own roots, so you don't have to worry about that as much. So, if they're not grafted, then, and that would be like our bush cherries and things like that, then there's two things. Number one, you don't have to worry about hardiness if the plant is hardy. But here's the other thing that happens from non-grafted trees. If something takes it out, say we just had someone last year that had to replace their honeyberries because they bought them and they were, they were just little plants, and their son went out to help mow and he just mowed everything. He mowed the honeyberries and everything. So the good thing is that you're going to have a true honeyberry come back from that, because there's no different, it's not grafted onto a rootstock. It's the true plant all the way to the roots. So probably you haven't killed the plant and you'll actually get something true. If your apple tree, say, gets wind, there's a bad windstorm and your apple tree gets broken off below the graft, then you're going to have to actually regraft that to get your new tree. All you've got now is a rootstock that's not going to produce, usually they don't produce an edible apple. But if you, then you can graft your apple of choice back on there. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does sometimes happen. And so it's good to know. I was going to pick on the Honeycrisp again, and I can't remember what I was going to say. So pardon me. If I remember what it was, I will bring it back up. So, another thing that people that's confused, this is even confusing to me, but again, because I'm so into simplification, hold on. You need to know if you need two plants for pollination. Some need to have two of a similar variety. Some need to have two different varieties that aren't related, and some can just self-pollinate. And those are things that you need to know, because when you're buying plants, you need to make sure that you know what you're doing. For one example, we sell honeyberries, and our honeyberries are they are not self-pollinating, and you have to be a little bit specific about what's going to pollinate with them. The majority of the plants that we sell will cross over enough that they'll pollinate together, but that's not the case for every plant that we have. So so when you purchase from someone, if you're purchasing, you need to ask, is it self-pollinating? But there's something to remember if it is self-pollinating, and that's this: even self-pollinating plants do from 10 to 25% more production if they have a second plant. So what I'm really doing is I'm giving you permission to, I'm giving you an excuse to buy more plants. So there you go. I just always, anything that I do, I usually do them in groups of 3. I don't know why, I just tend to. So, anything that I buy, I always buy plenty, because I want to make sure I've got pollination covered. I want to make sure, that even if one dies, we've still got, enough and everything. So, so know the pollination requirements. And again, you can never go wrong with 2 plants, because you will get more production. But, some places don't know that, like we, on our pre-sale, right on the website, we say, if you only have one, if you don't have any honeyberries, you need to order 2, because you have to have a second one in order for any production. We've had, I can't even count how many people we've had come to the farm and say, I have a honeyberry bush, it's never produced. And that's our first question: how many do you have? And they'll say, oh, we only have one. Or they'll say, oh, I have one in my front yard and one in my backyard. Well, they need to be within a few feet of each other in order to pollinate. They can't be, it's not like an apple tree. An apple tree can be like 150 feet or something like that. But honeyberries have to be much closer. So, so that's definitely another big thing to consider. Um, we also get asked a lot, what if if you can leave your orchard plants in pots. Like, let's say you bought an apple tree, you were going to plant it, then you decided, we hear this all the time, I decided to move my garden, or I decided to put my orchard in a different spot, and so I don't want to plant the tree until next year, until it's ready, or maybe they don't have the area fenced or whatever. And that's no problem. But here's what you need to do. There's a couple things you can do. The best practice is to take the potted apple or whatever you have, dig a hole, put the pot in the ground, just like you're planting it, only you're not actually planting it because it's still in the pot. Fill it in, and then do this in the fall before the ground freezes, and then just leave it there. That gives those roots the protection of being underground, so that they're not, so they're protected from the cold, they're protected from the wind, they're protected, the roots and that part are protected from critters, and that's just the very best thing that you can do. Now, not everyone can do that. So if not, then you just need to mulch the heck out of it. Jean recommends mulching with snow because snow will melt in the spring. If you mulch with wood shavings, a lot of times they get snow on them, and then they're kind of work as an insulator, and it's harder to get everything to melt in the spring because they're kind of insulating, and so it's harder to get that ice to melt that's kind of gone down in the wood chips. So it's best just to melt with snow because then it'll melt, then or to mulch with snow, so then it will melt. It'll melt accordingly in the spring. You also need to protect them, man. And not just from your son who's doing a good deed and trying to mow trying to mow your lawn. Um, you need to protect them from all sorts of critters. And here's where it gets really tricky. So we have a our fence is almost 10 feet tall. It's a little over 9 feet. And so we always get asked, how do you keep the moose out? And it's like, well, a 10-foot fence, we've never had a moose. We've had the back area isn't reinforced quite as well. And so we've had them kind of get in, but that usually the fence kind of scares them off. So, but funny story, this orchard is 12, 13 years old, something like that. And this year we had all of our kids or some of our kids were here, and we looked outside because the dogs were barking, and there was a mom and a calf moose inside the orchard. So Jean and Cameron went out, and they figured out the corner where they got in was this one super far away corner. But when they went in there, the moose went the opposite way. So we have 5 acres fenced, and she went all the way across the 5 acres to the other far corner and busted her way out on the other end. Well, the ground's frozen and we've got 2 feet of snow. There's no fence, there's no permanent fixed fencing right now. If a fence post busts off, you just kind of MacGyver everything together until spring. And but because it happened, it was almost dark. Jean ran him off. We weren't able to fix the fence until the next day. And the next morning, when we woke up, now remember, there's 2 holes in the fence. And he said, man, I think we scared him bad enough that I don't think they'll be back. It was a mama and baby. And the next morning we woke up and there was a bull laying in the currant patch. He spent the whole night in there. He made it look like none of them did a bunch of damage. There's definitely some damage in the orchard, but fixed the fence the next day and they haven't been back in. But so I'm telling you this story because number one, it's been years and we've never had any issue with moose inside, and we finally did. So there's no 100% absolute foolproof way to make sure that nothing is going to get to your trees. That's just impossible. But you can definitely put some things in place and, buy yourself 12 years by just building a good fence. But the other critters, there's some other things that you need to protect them for, and it's not all animals, by the way. So, but we're going to start with the animals. Voles and mice, they are the bane of our existence. I'm telling you, they will go in and just girdle a tree, and that's all you have to do to kill it. All you have to do is go all the way around a tree and get all the bark, so there's nothing attached, and there's no way to save that tree. So, and they burrow under the snow, so you can't even see, don't even know till the snow melts. So, excuse me. So that's a major bummer when that happens. The way to protect that is we actually have something different, but we're working on upgrading, but what we have is working okay for now. But the best way to do that is to get the metal screening, like your window screen that you would get. It comes in rolls, and wrap that around your tree, but don't wrap it around tight. It needs to be loose enough that the tree can grow, and you can just, because it's not solid, you can just leave it there for years until you either need to replace it when it starts to break down, which metal shouldn't do, or if the tree trunk gets too big and you need to replace it. So, but because it's not solid, it's got holes in it. It's nice and breathable. You need to push that all the way down into the dirt. So what we've been known to do, if a tree's roots are kind of close to the ground, and so the ground isn't super flat right there, we'll use landscape staples to make sure that it's all the way down and it's going to stay down. So that's our advice for mice and voles. I suggested a fence for moose, and but another really frustrating opponent we have are danged rabbits. It's hard to build a rabbit-proof fence. I think we'd have to do, I think chicken wire is the only way to keep them out, and we're not putting 7 acres of chicken wire up. Um, so, we just watch for them and do some varmint control here. We've got a dog that likes to take care of them. So, but rabbits are something because they can stay on top of the snow, so at least you can see them, right? You know that there's rabbits out there, you know you've got a problem, you need to go get trapping or hunting or whatever. But we had a tree last year. This was incredible to me. We had a tree last year that had, you could tell every time it snowed because I don't know why he always came to the same tree. It was out in the middle of the orchard, but he came out to the tree and he nibbled on it. There was a nice little nibble spot. And then if you came out to the orchard last year, you probably saw this because we showed everyone that would listen. And then he nibbled on it a little higher when it snowed some more, and then a little higher. And his final nibble was over my head. That's how deep the snow was last year. But he's just hopping along, but thankfully they don't typically girdle it, but it definitely makes your tree vulnerable when they've got a bunch of bare spots on them. And then something else to protect your trees, and this doesn't have to do with critters. This actually has to do with your environment, and that is to protect your trees from sunburn. So what happens in the spring is the sun starts to get really intense. And remember, our sun isn't ever overhead. It always comes in at the side. So it's always glancing off of the ground. And so what happens is it glances off of that snow and it hits your tree trunk, just as things are breaking dormancy in the spring. And it can really burn your tree, and that can kill your tree. We've actually lost a couple before we learned how to do this. So that's something, it's just, that's not a lower 48 thing. Most places in the lower 48 don't have to worry about their apple tree sunburning, but we do. So the thing to do with that, it's super simple. You just take latex paint and dilute it by half with water. So you've got half water, half paint, and paint it on your trees, and you paint it up pretty high on your trees, and you may just need to touch it up every once in a while. Just check it every fall, and if it looks like it needs to be touched up, do it. And but it's really simple, and you'll notice our trees are all painted white quite a ways up, and that's why. So another thing that I know some people do this, and so I'm not trying to be controversial, I'm just sharing what we do. You choose to do what you'd like. But especially since we're zone 2, we can't have anything slowing us down. We need to get right to it in the spring. So we don't use deep mulch around our trees. We just let the snow be the mulch around them. This is for our outside trees. So the mulch will slow down the thawing process. Remember when I talked about not mulching your pots with maybe sawdust or something? The same thing can happen in your orchard when you put a mulch of sawdust or something around it. That mulch, it kind of works as an insulator, which is really good in the winter, but come spring, it's still insulating. And then you've got, it slows down the thawing of the ground. And so it makes it so that your plants are going to stay dormant a whole lot longer. And most of us don't have the luxury of time. We just need to break dormancy and get going right away. So that's why we don't do that. And another thing to remember is that cold settles in low spots. And I kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want to reiterate, if you have low spots on your property, it doesn't mean you can't use them. It's just like your north facing spots. It doesn't mean that they can't be used. It means that what you need to do is um, you need to plant varieties that will do well. So an example, again, are honeyberries and Saskatoons. Another example is a currant. Currant plants also, you can plant on a north-facing slope. They'll do fine in a north-facing slope. But your apple trees, your plum trees, things like that, you do not want to face those on a north-facing slope. Those need to be south-facing because they just need, again, the advantage of time. So that's all I have for you today. I am open to questions. This will be a blog post. So if you see it on the blog, if you see it on YouTube, if you see it on the podcast, wherever, it doesn't matter. Be sure to post your questions, email them, whatever you need. And please remember our plant sale. I actually have an announcement to make. And this is kind of a big deal. So as I'm telling people, I'm trying to simplify it, but in the end, it's just a really big deal. So the University of Saskatchewan reached out to us and asked if we would like to get a propagating license for their patented honeyberry and cherry varieties. So we accepted, we've done all the legal part and the papers are signed. And so now it's official. So here's what that means. That means, so currently, let me back up. Currently, when you buy a honeyberry or a cherry, those have either been imported from Canada or they've been imported from from the lower 48, or someone's propagating them illegally, which is a bummer. We have been given the license. We're the only ones in the state who have this, and so we can actually propagate these plants. We actually started last year. We've known this for a minute, but we were trying to get all the legal stuff done first. That takes forever. Um, so now these plants will be started in Alaska. They'll be entirely Alaska grown. They'll be entirely hardy for our state. They'll also, we propagate as we do with everything else. We propagate 1 year and we don't sell till the next year because we want to make sure that that everything took well and that we're giving you a plant that's going to actually thrive. So the same thing will be the case, but the really cool part is it's going to be a whole lot cheaper. So we're going to be able to sell them for less than we've been selling them now, and we'll give you a better product because it's going to be entirely from the United States. Now, if you're buying from the plant pre-sale this time, we do have a few plants that we propagated, but we weren't fully running. This spring is when we'll be fully running. So all of our, the following year, the pre-sale that's a year from now will be to sell. Hopefully, the goal is all the plants that have been started right here on this farm. They're going to be a 100% Alaska product. Isn't that cool? And we're the only ones in the state who can do this legally. So it's a really big deal, and we're really excited to have been asked. What an honor. They reached out to us. It was a really, really big deal, and we're very grateful. Um, so yeah, that's kind of our exciting news. I'm sure we'll make another big announcement that's not tagged on to the end of a podcast. But anyway, if you have any questions, reach out. Happy to help. But it's time to start dreaming of what we're going to be doing in the spring. Did you know that we are only, what, 5 weeks from the days getting longer? We're going to get there. Spring is coming. All right. Have a good day.